For Cybercrime Radio, I'm Heather Engel. This is Cybertide, a cybercrime magazine podcast series brought to you by Adlumin. Working to revolutionize the way organizations secure sensitive data, Adlumin finds the newest cracks being exploited and shines a light on correcting the issue in real time with expert guidance. To learn more about our sponsor, visit adlumin.com. That's ADLUMIN.com. Today, I'm talking with Mark Sangster, Vice President and Chief of Strategy at Adlumin. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here, Heather.
Mark, those of us who work in cybersecurity have seen increased threats from nation-state cyber attacks. These attacks are well-funded. The attackers often have different motives. And so this is what we're talking about today. Can you start by telling our audience what a nation-state cyber attack is, how it might be different than your run-of-the-mill cyber attack, and what are some of the trends you're seeing?
Yeah, sure. So, a level set, right? A nation state's a country or an aligned group of countries targeting an economic competitor or seeking economic advantage through cyber attacks, right? And whatever that specifically means, which of course we're going to get to. Or they act through agencies. That's the other thing to think about it. So it may be, if it's direct, it's like their government's military or intelligence services, or they operate through a proxy organization, right? So that could be a domestic cyber criminal group. So we're all probably familiar with many of the Russian-based ransomware gangs. So that's a good example. In other cases, it's just turning a blind eye, right? It's letting some of these groups go that they know are politically aligned. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend philosophy, I suppose. And some of that even kind of bothers me. Like I just use the term cyber criminal group. And I'm finding more and more group, gang, whatever you want to call it. It sounds like a bunch of thugs. And the reality is they're not, right? That's quickly becoming a euphemism for armies, for navies, or paramilitary, or whatever you want to call it. If we call them mercenaries, it would have much more of an emotional charge rather than, oh, they're a gang. We don't think that much about it. And their attacks, like I said, right, they're disruptive. It could be ransomware, we shut you down, we extort you, or espionage purposes. And that's what I'm seeing a lot of growth in. The theft of intellectual property, particularly in countries like China. They're going after things like AI and medtech. So they'll create shell companies that invest in R&D that get some direct access to that information. Or it's even things like research grants. So this is going to things like academic institutions that are doing research in a laboratory, or they're donating free equipment. And of course, there's backdoors, right? They're just skimming off everything you're doing. And I don't think this is going to stop. It's gotten worse. We see ransomware gangs like Scattered Spider, the Panda family, targeting Western governments in Europe or North America, or organizations. And all of this is just, I think, sowing mistrust between the people and its institutions. We just don't believe our government or our law enforcement can protect us from this anymore.
And I really like the term mercenaries, because you're right. When we talk about it and we say group or gang, it doesn't really give the connotation of what we're actually dealing with.
Yeah, right. It's like saying if we talk about a gang, we think one thing. If we talk about the mob or the mafia, we suddenly think of this nebulous organization that has its tentacles in everything and you don't say no. And it's like a brand, right? It has an identity. I think we need to stop using these euphemisms, collateral damage and terms like that. It's not collateral damage. It's a company that got shut down or a hospital that couldn't treat patients because they were under a cyber attack. That's different when you put a human cost element on it versus, oh, well, my car got a scratch in it and I made an insurance claim and, now it's fixed. No harm, no foul.
Yeah. And so you mentioned hospitals. We think a lot about critical infrastructure when we talk about these nation state attacks. How has this concept of hybrid warfare changed the landscape of global security? And what are some of the implications here?
Oh, I think this is huge. Even hybrid is becoming a questionable term as we go back to the thought of euphemisms. But we all became really aware of this during the invasion of the Ukraine as a good example, right? Attacks on government agencies, utilities that have continued over the years, and hospitals as kind of pre and post-invasion tactics. It's a great way of softening up the target to drain their will to fight. And if you think in sort of traditional kinetic warfare, that would have been the bombs or the ships off the shore would pound the shoreline. So when the troops hit the beach, the defenses would be softened. It's the same kind of thing. And it's beginning to fuel kinetic war. And this is why I say all the lines are blurring here, right? For an example, in some of the research I've been doing on an upcoming book, I've been interviewing people, intelligence agents, UN, Overwatch individuals, and people on the bad guy side. And what we're finding is, for example, Ukraine influencers solicit their followers to purchase consumer level drones. They're going to their version of Best Buy or Amazon And then the combatants in the Ukraine weaponize those. They strap explosives on them and they fly them into the side of a tank or into a trench. It's gotten to the point where 2 out of every 3 Russian soldier is killed or wounded by these crowd-sourced weapons. So the kinetic side, the traditional, that's the military euphemism for bombs and guns and bullets and planes. And the cyber side of it, again, continue to blur. That's in a different dimension than shutting down hospitals. But you're right. The fact is, I use the term combatant and collateral damage, and it's true, right? I think it's blurring. There's no such thing as a combatant and a civilian. There's no such thing as collateral damage. It's just damage. If you're American or Western European and you get attacked, you're the enemy. Whether you run a law firm or a small accounting firm or a hospital, or whether you're wearing stripes on your sleeve and you salute the flag. Either way, you are considered the enemy of the state when it comes to these nation state attackers.
So, Mark, when we talk about nation state attacks, we have to wonder what our government is doing and what role international organizations play in responding. You mentioned the UN.
Mhm.
I also think about organizations like NATO or Interpol. What role do these organizations play in preparing for and responding to cyber attacks, and how effective are they?
I think because it's a hybrid war, I think because there's no declaration, to some degree, they're muzzled. So, NATO has war games that they run every year. They're cyber ops games. There's surveillance that they're conducting. In fact, we know the NSA. I work with one individual. He's now retired. He was the commander of an attack squadron at the NSA. So we do have offensive capabilities. Our intelligence and policing agencies are sharing more, right? Like Europol, Interpol, the FBI and Treasury and so on. But I still think it's passive, right? It's a bit like the police coming to the schools or to the community center and saying, look, we think auto theft or this type of violent crime is up, and here's the things we recommend. But it's still not proactive. It's not stopping it. It's not like there's police in your house waiting for the home invasion. They're just telling you to get a better lock and a dog and an alarm system. They're kind of in that post right of boom, first responder kind of approach. And I think that I'm sure there's things going on in the background that you and I don't know about. It's above our pay grade. But at the same time, it's a bit mind boggling because you think about if we were bombing another country, if that bomb went off in a bank, even if no one was harmed, or a bomb went off in the baggage carrier system in an airport, again, no one was physically harmed, we'd be losing our minds. That would be considered an act of war. Yeah, we don't. When it comes to this, it's like, and I think this is down to something in human nature about tactile versus abstract, that life and limb and so on, when it comes to risk, we've got innate fears built in that kind of guide our direction when it comes to response to those. But the more nebulous things like money and data and that kind of stuff, it's more wishy-washy and we respond in different ways. Yet at the end of the day, the two are linked. You shut down a hospital, you are affecting life-giving care. We do see this in high-risk situations, so things like strokes and heart attacks and critical care, where there is higher death rates because of the effects of a cyber attack. So how is that not murder, I guess is the question. It's got to be negligence or something. I'm not the lawyer, but it doesn't feel like it gets treated that way. It's treated in a much softer kind of thing, like, well, it's an unfortunate that this has happened, but that's a byproduct of the thing, and the thing itself wasn't all that bad. It is. Death is death. It's finite. So is that murder or is it not? And I think we need to start looking at it through that lens.
One of the things that I think about when I think about nation state attacks and even attack groups in general is that when we're thinking about offensive and defensive cybersecurity, we're really hamstrung by ethics and legal rules, right? In terms of what we can do from offensive and defensive security, where some of these nation state mercenaries and groups that we talk about really don't have that same boundary. So how do we then effectively combat or prepare for these kind of threats?
I agree with you, right? And I think this is why, to some degree, we're on our own because they don't play by the rules. There's no Geneva Convention for cyber warfare. I mean, I know there was that one treaty that was put in place, about 10 years ago now, right? That sort of said, hey, if we're not at war, don't attack our hospitals and utilities. But it's going on, right? So, it's not worth the ink that's on the paper. And they do have that advantage, right? They don't have to play by the rules. They can cheat. They can do what they want. And I liken it to, can you imagine, okay, we know corporations in the US get out of hand in certain things. But if they were doing things like killing employees of other companies and there's out and out piracy, right? I think of the Monty Python Meaning of Life when the insurance company turns into a pirate ship in the beginning. Same idea, right? We'd be losing our minds. We'd be putting rules in place and let's assume people would go to jail. But we don't when it's an individual of another country. And back in wartime, we used to say, hey, if you wore the uniform of your enemy or you wore civilian clothing and conducted combatant activities, you were considered a spy and you'd be shot. You lost the rights of a soldier. And yet we don't do that. And that's where I think companies have to be on their own for this, because I don't think the governments are reacting to it, right? They put out lots of warnings. Like I said, it's lots about don't walk down these dark alleys, but they're not stopping it. Like, at what point do we kind of go, look, man, this is an active war? And I realize it's tough because I think they're trying not to have this thing boil over into something bigger. But at what point do you kind of say, like, look, you've been poking and stabbing and, it's death of a thousand cuts, right? At what point are we going to recognize that they're boiling the frog here and we just haven't worked out that they're turning up the heat?
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
Adlumin Inc. provides enterprise-grade security to mid-market organizations. Its security operations platform and managed detection and response services combines all your data into one view to illuminate security risks and accelerate security workflows. Security teams are often stretched thin and are faced with increasing threats to respond to, like ransomware and data theft. Adlumin's patented technology simplifies these challenges by providing organizations with machine learning detection and automated response capabilities to halt threats quickly. The platform also includes threat hunting, automated incident response, vulnerability management, honeypots, darknet exposure monitoring, compliance reporting and monitoring, and more. Join the conversation and see how Adlumin can enhance your security program without increasing your workload. Visit adlumin.com.
And now, back to the podcast.
You have a book titled No Safe Harbor, and you're working on another book. And No Safe Harbor talks about the damage from not just nation state attacks, but cyber attacks in general, as well as wargaming. Tell us a little bit more about war games and what does that mean to a non-government organization?
So first, the other book that I'm working on now has sort of a preliminary title called Cyber Conscious Leadership, Practical Guide to Protecting Your Organization from Cyber Attacks. And what I was trying to do in that was I wanted to go a little deeper and figure out, like, how do the bad guys operate? What are they motivated by? We know it's money, but how is that? I found out that, a criminal makes 10 to 15 times what they would working for a criminal organization as they do working for IBM or, a legitimate software company. So we can see the motivation. And if they don't want the money, well, there's probably a gun at the back of their head. They're living in a stable place. They get to play along with the mob or they just end up a victim. But I think there's things we can learn from them. And I think we can learn from, like, the NATO war games, for example. So every year they conduct a cyber ops in Estonia, as an example. And it was a general there who started it. And the idea is that they're looking at traditional attack scenarios. And probably it's all formulated on things like, nuclear war, right? And how would we have responded to this and that? And all they did was transfer it to a cyber war. And of course, they've had a lot of good intelligence and observations, of course, have come out of the Ukraine and Eastern Europe now with the Russian invasion. So the idea here is use the same model in your organization. Like, take from the news stories. So if we saw that a hospital or a utility in the Ukraine was shut down and it was this ransomware gang and they used whatever tools, play that out in your own environment. As Churchill is attributed to saying, and as I found out writing the book, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think it's the same idea. Look, when something like this happens, play it out in your scenario. Red team, blue team it, right? Have your defensive team. Have some of those people be the aggressors. And if you don't have them, bring in people like you to help them do that and work them through those scenarios, because it's as close to real combat as you're going to get, right? I mean, obviously, until bullets are whizzing by and things like that, it's still not real. But I think the closer we get to it is the better. And a lot of that, I think, is going to shake up a false sense of security where you're suddenly going to go, oh, hang on a second, this little utility in the Ukraine, well, they did that because they're invading Ukraine. But then you realize they run the exact same systems as you do. They have the same business model and constituents and all that kind of stuff. And you suddenly go, well, if they can do it to you, they can do it to me. We saw attacks against water treatment plants throughout the US, one in Texas overflowing a water management system, and the big water tower exploded with water and all that kind of stuff. Like, recognizing that one day you might be sitting at peace right now, but one day you might be the next Pearl Harbor. And you got to figure out, how are you going to spot it early? And how are you going to try and mitigate whatever the threats are so that you reduce the risk that you face and you come out the other side mostly unscathed.
You make a great point there where we call them viruses for a reason, which is you don't often have a lot of control over how it spreads. You can think that you're going to attack one specific system and then it jumps. We saw that with Stuxnet and, as you mentioned, a couple of other examples. So what are some examples you've seen where nation state attacks and geopolitical influence is now shifting our operational strategy?
One of them, I don't know, it did. I'll start there. I mean, gosh, it's got to be like 10 years ago that a major mining company in Canada was up for sale for like just south of 50 billion and was going to be bought by an Australian firm. And China got in on it, and they attacked multiple levels of government, 7 different law firms, the targeting firms, and they were literally intercepting information mid-merger. Like, hey, the offer is $46 billion today. And they would intercept that and put in a counteroffer at $47 billion. Things like that eventually became public, and it shut down. It stopped it from occurring, but it only occurred because of an embarrassment. At that time, I don't think companies learned from it. They saw it as a one-off, but they lost a $50 billion deal, man. Like, that's pretty serious. And in fact, I bumped into one of their people down the road, and they said, oh yeah, we had a minor IT issue. And I'm like, man, I would love to be able to call $50 billion loss minor. But looking at ones where we've learned our lessons, right? I was personally involved in a nation state attack on a US law firm. And again, it was the Chinese government going after the law firm because they had publicly threatened on social media that they would retaliate against anyone who assisted an individual who was seeking citizenship in the US, and anyone who helped, they were going to attack. And they made true on that. And they went after this law firm. They were into everything, and they had full access to what was going on and full control. And so you have to start to think about what are the potential risks that a client brings and do that assessment. Don't just do it on your vendors. And I've used that all the time in desktops. And I'll change it. It might not be that, but I might say, oh, I don't know, you're trading some material that's used in the development of, let's say, lithium batteries and graphite. And so, there's a strong geopolitical competition over that. And what's that going to do? And are you going to be targeted by nation states? Just to think about, just take your eyes off the dollars for a minute and think about, okay, the deal's worth $5 million. But what's it going to cost you to protect the organization from the threats that come with it? Is it going to be more or less? It's just a business decision. I'm not telling you what the right answer is. And I think the same goes for things like sensitive or politically charged alignments. So like I said, we're not just talking about tobacco, alcohol, and firearms anymore. It's other things. And understanding where the money comes from. Working with the government agencies to determine to some degree attribution. So I talked earlier about shell companies that can be traced back to nation states that have been funding either private research, government research, or academic research, things like medtech, DNA and genome mapping. And they're giving you the money, but nothing's free. It's a Trojan horse where now they're in and it gives them access. And one example I have is a medical tech firm. I know the CISO. They opened up an office in Beijing and they found backdoors and everything. And they literally packed it in less than a year later because everything they had, everything they were developing was being stolen. And it was blatant. So they just got to the point of like, we can't do this. And so they yanked it back out. I've picked on China a few times here, but there's others doing it too. And I think that's where you really have to be cautious, or we've seen a lot of issues come up with universities getting grants and research funding. And it turns out that it rolls back up again to a nation state. And the reason they're doing it is that they get access to that intellectual property. So in a weird way, it's like we're constantly trading with the enemy. It's this strange new world. And so I think it's like before you ink the contract, you can't just look at the dollars and cents in the black. You've got to think about what's going to happen on the bad side of the ledger and what could it cost you? So is it worth doing? Just because you can shortcut and get to market faster, that might give you a short-term advantage. But in the long run, if somebody has your intellectual property and now they can produce your drug for a fraction of the cost and distribute it faster, what's that going to cost you in terms of global value? So we really have to think about these things. And there's plenty of these lessons to learn from.
Mark, anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think it's going away. It's going to get worse. And the reality is, I can't even call it a Cold War anymore. Like, I think it's a warm war. The question is, when's it going to boil over? When is an attack on a utility or a major outage like this going to be too much, where there's just going to be a point where we probably start with political retaliation, trade tariffs or whatever, sanctions or something. But at some point, somebody's got to realize that this kind of attack can do as much, if not more damage than a rocket or a missile or a bullet.
You make a great point. And I think with a lot of organizations, they have to look outside of just what's right in front of them, right? And think about the strategy of what they're actually doing, what they do to make money, and how that could potentially be exploited in a nation state attack.
Exactly. Your risk model, risk assessment, look at your business model, what comes along with it. If you're in healthcare, patient records being stolen, that's clearly an obvious risk. If you're a bank, money in the vault. We've just got to take that approach and now spread it across all industry, all targets, and think about what's valuable to you. What would somebody potentially want to steal? And what damage would it do if they did?
Mark, thanks as always for being on the podcast.
You're very welcome. Always a pleasure.
For Cybercrime Radio, I'm Heather Engel. Cybertide is a cybercrime magazine podcast series brought to you by Adlumin. Working to revolutionize the way organizations secure sensitive data, Adlumin finds the newest cracks being exploited and shines a light on correcting the issue in real time with expert guidance. To learn more about our sponsor, visit adlumin.com. That's ADLUMIN.com.